Hello and welcome to the FATBOSS Guide to the Conclave of the Chosen in the Battle of Dazar'alor.
You'll be fighting 4 bosses over the course of this fight, but a maximum of 2 at any given time. When one boss dies, a new one will enter until you're just left with the 4th and final boss. A large amount of this fight is pretty much just don't stand in the bad, but there are some very important timings the raid will need to take into account to keep the fight clean. So let's kick straight into this.
Whilst fighting the bosses, you'll want to keep them at least 7 yards apart at all times, otherwise they'll gain a 75% damage dealt increase and will take 90% less damage until you drag them apart again. Also, when a boss dies, another will join. At the same time, the other active boss and new boss will be healed to full health and gain a 15% damage increase. This makes multi-tossing and cleaving pretty useless, but some classes might want to do it if it does give them a single target damage increase. Additionally, on Heroic, when a boss dies, the raid will take a bunch of damage over 6 seconds. This can really hurt, especially when it overlaps with other incoming raid damage, so healers need to be prepared to counter this with cooldowns when necessary. With all of this in mind, let's have a look at the bosses. The fight always starts with the Paku aspect and the Gonk aspect.
Paku will gain stacking attack speed when melee hitting the same target, and this will reset when she hits a new target. It's up to your tanks when they want to taunt swap to get this debuff to drop, but we recommend that you do it around the 20 stack mark. Alternatively, a melee DPS can just taunt to get hit once to reset the buff, then the tank can taunt quickly back, meaning that the boss doesn't need to move at all. Now Paku at full energy will buff all bosses and adds with a 15-second purgeable buff, which gives them 45% haste and 75% movement speed. This does need to be purged as soon as possible just to keep the fight under control, but keep in mind, mages can spell steal this and get a nice little DPS boost. Now each boss has a permanent Wrath ability. This ability will be cast throughout the fight, long after the boss it's tied to has died. Paku's permanent Wrath ability will spawn a bird in the middle of the room. This bird will fly to a random edge of the encounter space and then channel over 8 seconds, dealing huge damage to all players further than 10 yards away from it. Anyone within 10 yards will take a heavily reduced amount of damage. Now the entire raid needs to stand within the 10 yard zone underneath the bird. The bosses should be tanked at either side of the zone just to make sure that they do not buff one another. Now bosses should be generally killed around the same time as Paku's Wrath, something that we'll be getting into a little bit later, but this will trigger additional AoE damage. Healers will 100% need to have cooldowns available at these times just to counter both sources of damage. Now as the bird will fly to a random edge of the room, the raid should be loosely spread around the middle of the encounter space throughout the fight, as to be sure that they can get to it regardless of what side it flies to. Now moving on to the other boss, which is Gonk's aspect. Gonk will frequently apply a 5-second curse debuff to several players, hexing them, which will stop them from attacking or casting spells. Just like the debuff in the Dazar'alor 5-man dungeon, this will spread to all other players within 8 yards when it expires. So if you do get this debuff, you need to quickly move away from the raid to stop it from spreading all over the place. For tanks, Gonk will occasionally turn into a raptor and hit you with several cleave attacks. Just make sure you're not facing him towards any players. Now Gonk's permanent Wrath ability will spawn a raptor in the 4 corners of the room. These raptors will each fixate a random player and chase them down whilst gaining a stacking movement speed increase. These raptors hit really hard, so you want to kite them whilst all DPS focus them down, using stuns, knockbacks and slows just to keep them under control. On Heroic, these raptors will actually buff one another if they get too close to each other, giving a 75% movement speed increase and immunity to CC for 5 seconds. This makes kiting them that much harder, so you really want to keep them apart. Now these raptors will frequently spawn during Paku's Wrath. It's best just to keep any nearby raptors at bay using CC whilst the raid is huddled underneath the bird. Once the storm has subsided, fixated people can then kite their raptors away from one another whilst everyone else kills them off. Also, raptors will be buffed by Paku's Gift of the Wind if she casts it, so make sure you dispel them quickly. Now regardless of what boss you kill, the next boss that will spawn will be Kimbul, and once another one dies after that, it will be Akunda. That means that you do get to decide what order you kill the bosses. We really highly recommend that you kill Paku first, as her Gift of the Wind buff can be very dangerous if not dispelled quickly. But that being said, killing Gonk is also not a terrible idea because you remove his hexes. One thing that is generally agreed on is that you should always focus the boss that you've decided not to kill last time, as they will have a stack of the 15% damage increase. Either way, what must be understood is that when a new boss activates, their new permanent Wrath ability timer will begin at that exact moment. That means if you kill a boss at the wrong time, the permanent Wrath ability could happen at the same time as Paku's Wrath, which is really going to cause some problems. To make sure that you do not have these overlaps, always kill the first and second boss just before or during Paku's Wrath. Just as a note, if you do Bloodlust on the pool, you will need to stop damage to get this timing, so it's best that you just save this for later. So with that out of the way, congrats, you've killed Paku during her Wrath. Kimbul will now join the fight.
Now Kimbul only has one active ability, which is Lacerating Claws. This will deal burst of damage to all players in a cone directed at the tank and apply a really nasty dot for 45 seconds. The tank needs to make sure that he faces Kimbul away from other players, and you will need to taunt off one another to let your stacks drop, generally around the 2 to 3 stack mark. Kimbul's permanent Wrath ability will cause a big cat to appear in the middle of the room, which will mark several players. It will then jump to those players in turn, dealing damage, knocking them down, and applying a permanent dot to anyone within 5 yards of them. If you are marked, you need to make sure that you quickly move away from anyone else, otherwise a bunch of people will gain the stack of the permanent dot, and your healers are definitely going to hate you for it. We recommend that you get Gonk out the fight at this point, as his curses really are a pain, but just like before, make sure that the boss dies just before or during a Paku's Wrath. You may need to hold off damage to get this point correct in these early weeks of the tier. After Gonk is dead, Akunda will join the fight. Now Akunda will cast Thundering Storm, which deals damage to anyone within 10 yards of her once the cast ends. This is really easy to move out of, but she can cast it during a Paku's Wrath, so it's very important that you tank her right on the edge of it, just to give enough space for everyone else to move around in. Akunda will also apply Mind Wipe magic debuffs to several players in the raid. This removes the player's ability to cast any spells or use any abilities. Healers need to make sure they dispel this as soon as possible, prioritizing other healers first so they can also help dispel. Now Akunda's permanent Wrath ability will debuff a few players in the raid. After 6 seconds, those players will explode, dealing damage to anyone within 5 yards, and also send out orbs which will travel all across the room and deal damage and stun any player who touches them for 2 seconds. When you get this, you just want to spread out as far away from others as you can, just so everyone has lots of time to move from the orbs. At this point, you just need to kill the boss that has the highest damage increase stacks, which will be Kimbul if you've been following our recommendations, and really this is like the hardest point of the fight, because you have all the Wraths up as well as 2 bosses, so you should probably lust here just to get Kimbul out the fight as soon as possible. What we do recommend though is not to kill Kimbul during or just before a Paku's Wrath, as the combined damage of the two at this particular point of the fight might just be too stressful for your healers. But after you've killed Kimbul off, you're only going to have Akunda left. Simply just kill her off whilst dealing with the 4 other Wrath abilities. And that's the encounter. However, one thing we haven't mentioned yet is that on Heroic you will have an additional Wrath ability to deal from the very start of the fight, which is Kragwa. Frequently a big toad will appear in the middle of the encounter space, and it will then leap to one of the 3 furthest players. When it lands, it deals damage and knockbacks anyone within its targeting circle. The time it takes for the toad to jump from one location to another is set, regardless of how far it jumps. This means that you always have enough time to move from the swirly circle, even if the toad only jumps 2 yards. Typically, this ability by itself is pretty easy to deal with. It does, however, overlap with the 1st, 4th, and 5th Paku's Wrath. People need to make sure they keep a real close eye on the floor to make sure they dodge the zones, as getting knocked out one of the safe zones and into the area where you'll be taking a stupid amount of damage from the Paku's Wrath will pretty much instantly kill you unless you have a large damage reduction, amazing healers, or an immunity.
But thank you very much for watching, guys. If you do want more information on this encounter with detailed tooltips and useful images to refer to during your raid, then do go and check out our written work over on Wowhead. A link for that can be found in the description below. If this guide did help you out, then make sure you do throw a like on it. It helps us out so much. And once again, thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next one.
Catch you later.